So
Awesome.
Elias, how are you holding up during COVID?
I'm pretty good. What's called been training and kind of just making do as per usual. It kind of never training never stops, and there's no off season in mixed martial arts and in training, and that includes even with COVID. Obviously, during some of the lockdowns and whatnot, I had to alter it, but I'm good. I'm here, and I'm excited to chat.
Yeah, I'm excited as well. Obviously, you're an MMA fighter. You've had great
Mm-hmm.
success with the Ultimate Fighter in 2014. You had great success in the UFC. What drew you to fighting in the first place?
Yeah, I was a fan first and foremost. I kind of started later than most. In many ways, I was kind of enlightening the mind, and I thought the body should follow. And I was at my first year of university, and after my first not semester, first year, I kind of just went to a gym. A friend of mine, or my brother's friend, had been training for many years, and one day I just kind of showed up and never left. And I kind of fell in love with it. And at first it was more of a hobby than as some of the amateur and some of the dreams to potentially be one of those guys on TV in the Ultimate Fighter. It eventually became a reality. I even vividly remember, I think it was like UFC 175 or something like that, and jokingly talking to my dad, like, I'll be there before UFC 200. I think I can do this. And I ended up, evidently was.
Well, so you mentioned you kind of got into fighting a little later than most. What was the period between you saying, I enjoy this, and then you being in the UFC?
Um, it was just basically showing up and losing every single day in the gym, and then still having the audacity and tenacity to show up every single day the next day with just as big of a smile as I did the day before. And the first day turned into 6 months, 6 months turned into a year, and then within 4 years, I actually won the Ultimate Fighter.
Wow. So were you just naturally good at it, did you find? Did you,
Well,
verse people and they're like, wow, you're pretty impressive?
Well, I got in a lot of high school fights. I didn't start
Okay.
them. I didn't finish them. Or I didn't start them. I finished them. And a little bit of a wild child, younger, and I didn't have a sense of purpose, I'd say. And mixed martial arts very much found that purpose. So many people realize, well, when they get punched in the face, whether they fight or flight. And again, I didn't really necessarily look for fights, but I definitely finished them. And then
Okay.
I showed up, actually, even like kind of digging deeper into that on that aspect. I was, not to toot my own horn because it actually means nothing, but I was like undefeated, if you will, in high school. So like my high school amateur record was undefeated. And then came back for my first year of university at the old watering hole, and I picked a fight with someone I shouldn't have because I may have had a couple of wobbly pops. And then next thing you know, he was very much embarrassed me, and I kind of like laughed it off the night of or whatever like that. And then the next day, I worked at Foot Locker at the time, and I'm kind of telling my friends the story, et cetera, et cetera. And one of my friends comes up and goes, "Hey, are you okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah, why? What's up?" He goes, "It's on YouTube." And I'm like, "What's YouTube?" And sure enough, my fight went viral and whatnot. So undefeated in high school, and then my first, I guess, pay-per-view on YouTube. What's it called? Free pay-per-view or whatever, viral moment. It's called. It was embarrassing, deflating, and I was just demoralized. And I confided in my father, like, "Dad, what do I do?" And he's just like, "Well, you love that UFC stuff so much. Why don't you go to the gym and make sure this never happens again?" And I did. And originally, it was more or less to learn a couple of things and find this guy and challenge him again. And then I
Mm.
just was over it and kind of centered myself. And then I was able to kind of pair my degree in advertising with my degree in mixed martial arts, if you will. And then jumped in before my fourth year of martial arts, pretty much right after I got my degree. My parents are like, "What do you want to do?" Like, because I had like offers from an ad agency and whatnot. "Where are you gonna go?" I'm like, "I'm going to Thailand," and I just went for Thailand and got in a bunch of fights there, legit fights, kickboxing fights, and I fell in love with it even more. And I knew, like, yeah, like, especially the first time I got paid for fighting, even though it wasn't too much, it was like $300 or something like that. first time I got paid for it, it just became that much more real, and kind of
Mm.
been chasing that ever since. And now at this point, at 9 years professional, at the age of 32, I really feel I'm just kind of not even in my prime yet.
Yeah, and obviously you are quite famously, I think the first Canadian, maybe one of the first in the world,
Yep.
athletes to receive a therapeutic use exemption, a TUE for cannabis. Before we touch
hmm
on that, what drew you to cannabis in the first place? Were you like a recreational user? How did that come about?
Um, yes and no. I dabbled in it when I was younger in some capacity, more on the recreational side. Cannabis is very prevalent in Canada. I think
Mm,
our youth, I think like 20% youth usage at some point or another, or constant. I don't know the statistic more specifically. And that was actually part of the whole reasoning for legalization in the first place, and the idea that creating a legal market to create those barriers in regards and those age gated barriers. But once I started getting into mixed martial arts, I thought sports and cannabis were diametrically opposed with each other, and I kind of had a little bit of a stigma in my own right, in the capacity of how I felt towards it afterwards. But it wasn't until my coach at the time, who's been a patient for over 15 years, I saw the benefits that he got it opposed to first line medicines like opioids and painkillers. And then when you top that with, again, going to different trips to Thailand and other places in the US or locations that don't have medical cannabis, I saw what having to be on those first line medicines did to his body. And that was something that really stayed with me, to the point where when my own condition of bilateral neuropathy, which is essentially nerve damage of my upper extremities, started to show itself in regards to my day to day and also my athletic career. I knew that opioids definitely weren't for me, and not only from that experience, but my own experience in regards to what caused part of my bilateral neuropathy in regards to surgery. And I knew how those own first line medicines kind of tortured my body beyond the actual pain that I felt. And consulting with my doctor about cannabis and other forms of medicine, we realized that cannabis was best for me. Again, not only because cannabis helped me in regards to my bilateral neuropathy, the nerve damage, being able to treat it uh, directly that way, but also the side effects that secondary or first line medicines had on my body, whether it was something like Lyrica or gabapentin or all the other types of laundry lists that they essentially offered instead, in regards to the organization, United States Anti-Doping Agency, as an alternative to cannabis. It was very detrimental.
and in what ways were these first line like opioid medications detrimental? You mentioned, I think your manager was suffering quite heavily from it. You suffered quite
My
heavily
coach,
from
my
your
coach
coach,
at the
sorry.
time. Yeah. No, no,
What
no need to apologize. That's very Canadian of you.
I should be Canadian. What were some of the symptoms you were noticing?
Yeah, well, again, one that I brought up, for instance, Lyrica, it would create constipation, it would bloating. So, as someone that walks around about 205, 207 pounds, and I cut down to 185 through a weight cut process, right? And it's a very regimented process that takes about 4 to 5 weeks, where calorie counting, et cetera, kind of switching my diet up and whatnot. The Lyrica, for instance, would add like 10 more pounds on me just because of the bloating. So now
Mm.
not only do I have to cut the weight that I normally have, it now adds the constipation, the stress of that weight. It adds the stress of having to mentally knowing that, and again the overall detriment that has to me as both a patient and an athlete. Again, the first line medicines added a additional burden in regards to what I already have to cope with in regards to my medical condition. Furthermore, the way the process works to get a therapeutic use exemption, I had to essentially exhaust all other options approved, because the stigma is very real in the U.S. So too is their anti-doping agency, which is funded by the U.S. government, that looks at cannabis as a Schedule One drug, which means it has no medical property. Furthermore, the fact that Canada has medical rights, but the U.S. doesn't, because medicine isn't a fundamental universal right in the US. So that was an uphill battle arguing on the proposition of therapeutic use exemption. They didn't look at cannabis as a medicine. So what they essentially made me do was take every drug under the sun for a 9-week rotation just to prove that it wasn't, to the point where my family doctor, who I've known my whole life, who's been helping me throughout this process, he's scratching his head because by pill 10 they're telling you to take antidepressants. By 10, by 12 pill 12 they're telling you to take even more antidepressants. The anti like I'm not depressed. And to the point where he would scratch his head and say, we don't really diagnose this kind of like your condition this way. We don't really diagnose it this way. This is stuff that we did in the 80s when we were kind of shooting everything with a shotgun in regards to the way that the process just kind of numb the pain, because again, the antidepressant is just numbing me, and then I won't notice my pain.
I mean, that sounds like an arduous process and a dangerous one when you consider maybe the addictive tendencies of
Yes.
opioids. Having to go through, so was it 9 weeks for all of the drugs? Or was it 9 weeks
Yeah.
per drug? Okay, that's not
Per drug. No. Sorry, per drug. Per drug. Yeah, you
wow.
basically have to do 9 weeks on it just to prove that, oh, you know what, this week you felt like crap, but that could have just been a fluke. Or you have to get adjusted to this painkiller for the next 3 weeks just so it starts working.
Wow.
Like
And
again, it's a backwards. There is medical reasoning for a lot of things, especially on the more extreme, conditions and extreme medicines and whatnot that you do have to adjust. But that's only because they look at cannabis as a worse drug than opioids, painkillers. Like, in a scale of 1 to 10, cannabis is at like a 9 to them, where a painkiller, an opioid, which is way more addictive, way more deadly in the capacity of the fact that we have cannabinoid receptors that can actually intake cannabis in a natural way versus the way that opioids are designed, essentially the hacker system in a different way, right? So again, it's a very outdated and I'd say dangerous mindset. And fast tracking to the therapeutic exemption itself. Part of that was when I parted ways with the UFC and what became a free agent. I ironically was able to become a agent of change, and that was through applying through again a Canadian commission, British Columbia more specifically, which is again attached to the British Columbia government and Canadian government more broadly speaking. So I was able to argue both on a British Columbia and also Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom that cannabis is a fundamental right prescribed to me and afforded to me as a part of my fundamental right as a Canadian. And the commission and also their ringside doctors agreed, and I was approved for my therapeutic use exemption. And one of the more interesting things and kind of the clarifications between USADA and the therapeutic use exemption that I got, that I would argue that this is actually even more consequential because of the fact that this is actually an arm of the Canadian government. This is the provincial government that is approving my use of cannabis in sport, and that's even more of a first in sport and a first in actual government policy towards cannabis in competition, and that has reverberates actually beyond even BC into Canada in a way that I can actually now validate my therapeutic use exemption throughout Canada because of that validation, and even more so the way that actually North America commissions work together. They actually validate all the positive and negative rulings in different jurisdictions. So example being, let's say if I got caught for a steroid, because that's what essentially cannabis is considered under, it's called a prohibited substance in New York, and I was suspended for a year, and I wanted to, let's say, get approved in California to compete, they would tell me, no, you cannot apply for a license until your suspension is up. Well, so too is now a positive ruling for my therapeutic use exemption. All of the commissions are inclined to actually listen to them, more specifically if they have medical rights in their own right. So like the state's rights can supersede the actual federal one. So now it's the case where I no longer have to argue why medical cannabis is right for me. The jurisdictions that I go to moving forward have to prove why BC is wrong, and they don't like doing that.
Okay, so you don't have an exemption, let's say, throughout all of the US, but on kind of a case-by-case basis, there's a
Yes, and
likelihood that
I'll
you
be able to
will.
knock. Yeah, and more so, it actually creates precedent. So the precedent that I created in BC now opens the door for any athlete, both amateur and professional, in boxing and MMA, can apply for a therapeutic use exemption in BC. And moving forward for myself, I only compete in places that respect my fundamental right to medicate. And I've already been talking to different commissions and different opportunities and avenues to validate said therapeutic use exemption moving forward. So right now I have British Columbia, and the game plan is to validate my therapeutic use exemption there once we get final approvals in regards to protocols on what they're planning on doing in regards to the commission, post COVID and whatnot. But moving forward, I plan to validate my therapeutic use exemption as both fighter and promoter in a 19 plus cannabis friendly event.
And when you say therapeutic use, what does that look like? Is that smoking joints? Is that eating brownies? And is that
It's
right up
so
until the point of the fight?
well. So basically, the therapeutic use exemption I argued on two different fronts.
Mm.
One, I said it's a fundamental right as prescribed by my doctor and afforded to me my fundamental right as a Canadian for healthcare and universal care. Two, I said their standard of testing is flawed because they use the same standard of testing in regards to your fat, whether you're a 105-pound woman or you're a 265-pound man. And everyone, kind of distributes and loses or gains weight differently. So having a blank standard is actually flawed, and they agreed. And that's why actually most heavier set fighters and also females get busted for get busted for cannabis in their system because it stays. For females more specifically, it actually persecutes them for their body because of the water fat ratio that they naturally have in regards to their body. So again, that's another thing that I'm looking to kind of bring out and kind of let people know that the standard of testing is flawed. And the therapeutic use exemption is not just for cannabis broadly, it's actually for THC and THCA. THC, I'm allowed to consume it and not have them look at my threshold in regards to points per million in regards to cannabis, cannabinoids in my system. The threshold, for instance, in the UFC and more standardly is about 150 nanograms per million or whatever it ends up being. Whereas mine, it's probably 1,000 at any given moment. But so they won't look at it in any way, shape, or form in a negative sense. Moreover, THC and THCA, I vaporize with cannabis, both as an advocate and also as an athlete. I try to consume cannabis in the healthiest way. So I vaporize it. For instance, I tend to use my Sturts and Bickle, vaporizer, where I'll still have the flower. And I can actually break down my whole regimen for you in many ways. What I do, I'll wake up in the morning, and part of this is an actual protocol that I have where there's pain scoring. So I see how my body feels. If I'm on a higher level, I tend to do a more high dose of tinctures in the morning. Usually it's a 1-to-1, but sometimes I'll do the THC specific. Then I'll apply topicals in any area that is sore, any cramps, any stingers that I kind of have as a result of my as a result of my condition. And then from there on, I actually add THCA in raw cannabis. So raw cannabis, for those that don't know, has all the anti-inflammatory properties and also a lot of other types of nutrients that aren't lost through the applying of heat. Going from THCA to THC, much like when you cook any of your food, it loses a little bit of nutrients, obviously.
Mm,
And the big difference with this is there's no psychoactive component because there's no combustion or no heat applied with the THCA. So I put it in my smoothie. I add it to kale, and then whatever it ends up being, protein, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm consuming more cannabis and more anti-inflammatory properties before I go to my next training session. And after my next training session, after my first training session, I'll vaporize as mentioned, and then either use that to recover in the sense of stretching or rehab with my physio coach, et cetera, et cetera. Cannabis, both the pain management and also the holistic aspect, allows me to be more in tune to my body and in tune where the areas that are affected in regards to my condition. Throwing a nap if I'm lucky, and then kind of rinse and repeat in regards to my next training session, and then vaporize again. And there's when I more switch to the heavier indicas or indica dominant in regards to that pain management, and kind of decompressing from the day. And then actually one thing that not many people know, cannabis actually doesn't make you not dream. You just tend not to remember your dreams. So what I do to counterbalance that, I do high doses of CBD at night, and I tend to dream every single night. I love dreaming. I'm a lucid dreamer, so that's
oh,
a way
wow.
I kind of combat any of the THC. Not necessarily a side effect, just kind of uh, the way it kind of works in regards to THC. You tend not to remember your dreams as much.
Well, you just mentioned CBD, and I believe that's been legal in the UFC for fighters to use for a couple of years now. And that, as you mentioned, THCA is non-psychoactive, as is CBD. Did you find that CBD was not sufficient for you? Is that why you made this push for THC, or was it more of a freedom grounds? Were you more of, I deserve to be able to try what I want?
Well, I'd say both. My therapeutic use exemption is using cannabis as a pain management source. So CBD, although there are some components in regards to the anti-inflammatories, it doesn't have the same punch, if you will, as THC does in regards to pain management. And the plant comes with both. So in order to true having the harnessing the actual plant, you need both.
Yeah, I believe it's called the entourage effect, which is that
Yes. Yep.
if CBD is isolated, although it's powerful, it doesn't have the same effect as when combined with THC. So it's funny that we're seeing
100%.
CBD become so popular. And in the process, I mean, it's a great thing. But we are missing that slight element of the entourage effect, which is probably going to help
Mhm.
way more people in the process. But you mentioned at the start of the interview that you had a bit of a stigma about cannabis and you thought that cannabis and fighting were diametrically opposed. Do you train while stoned ever? Do you fight while stoned ever? And if so, how does that make you feel?
No, I tend to kind of go into training with a clear mind, and my therapeutic use exemption. Part of again the argument that I had through my counsel was that cannabis shouldn't be looked at any different than any other type of narcotic, any other type of potential performance enhancing or narcotic in the sense of alcohol. So, for instance, alcohol, they don't test you for it, but if you're impaired, then they won't let you compete. I'm
Mm.
asking to have a official because it's the official's job to make sure I'm not impaired, and that's basically the way it kind of stands.
Okay. And then what are your thoughts on something? This may seem like a trivial comparison, but on something like caffeine, that's been described by a lot of people as somewhat of a natural performance enhancer. Could you see cannabis in the same light in any sense? And do you think we should be testing for caffeine? How does that work?
Well, they do test for caffeine, but at a certain dosage. So you just can't have more than, I think it's something like 6 cups of coffee, essentially, in
Okay.
some capacity. So there is something to that. Again, anything in moderation. But again, the standard for cannabis, more specifically, shouldn't be the way that they're testing now. It should be impairment, more plain and simple.
Mm. And you mentioned this earlier, you have your Rise FC event this fall.
Yeah.
Is this going to be the first fight that you have done since your therapeutic use exemption was passed?
It will be the first fight in the sense, yes. One little caveat would be my fight prior to this, I fought in Ontario, where Ontario, because it never had cannabis as a prohibited substance, I was essentially able to medicate all the way through. And the results speak for themselves. I got a TKO finish in a dominating fashion against another former UFC fighter. And what's it called? Without giving too much away, I kind of plan to do the same thing.
Okay, because you've previously mentioned in other interviews that you're not necessarily fighting any one man, but you're fighting for the right to use cannabis, therapeutically speaking. And do you find that there's a bit of additional pressure now for you in the sense that people are looking at you as a cannabis advocate? And if you suddenly lose 100 matches, people may perceive that to have been the cannabis. Do you feel any of that pressure, or do you just not think about that?
Well, there's always pressure. I'm getting in a fist fight, right? Like
Mm,
in many ways, that pressure is kind of always there, and you enjoy the fight almost the longer after it happens, because that's when the relief happens. At first, in many ways, it's this build up to this one moment where all that matters is game day. You can have been perfect, literally leading up to a fight, and then if you have one bad day, an unfortunate day is your actual time to fight, and sucks to be you because the best guy doesn't always win.
mm. And do you see what you're doing now and the work that you're doing with cannabis? Do you see this paving the way for other sports and other countries, athletes in across the world? Do you see any kind of changes happening slowly that you're witnessing going, hey, I kind of started that. I kind of snowballed this.
Well, again, the precedent in its own right, in regards to no other athlete will have the same hurdles that I did in BC and Canada, more broadly speaking. Again, not only in mixed martial arts, but also basketball, and also boxing. And then, what do you call it? Moving forward, I plan to again validate my therapeutic use exemption in jurisdictions that don't have the same medical rights that I do in Canada, whether it's the US and abroad. And obviously, as someone like myself that's very into regulatory and kind of finding not necessarily loopholes, but ways to knock them down. Today it's BC. Tomorrow will probably be America, and then the world.
Yeah. And touching on America, your view on cannabis and the view, I think, more broadly, entirely contradicts their scheduling, which is that there's no accepted medical use for cannabis. Even though I think in 33 states now, cannabis is medically legal in the US, it's legal obviously in Canada. What do you think about that? What do you think about the current scheduling and the kind of contradictions within it?
Well, it's just outdated mindset, and it all stems from racism. You can go back to the 1930s, in regards to William Randall Hearst, who owned all the cotton mills and all the newspapers at the time, was afraid of hemp being a superior product than cotton, and then basically put propaganda that cannabis gave minorities superhuman strength, and they're attacking different people. And obviously, racism prevailed with the attorney general at the time, and they put laws into place. And from there, you fast track to Nixon and his war on drugs, where he couldn't put the biggest people that were opposed to the Vietnam War to jail just because of their free speech. So he criminalized things that they happened to partake in more than the other average, American. And obviously, go fast track to the 80s and 90s, where they had zero tolerance on cannabis. And the fact that there's like millions of people that have either been put to jail or are still in jail because of a plant. And again, the for-profit prison system that they have in the U.S. is another big contributing factor. The DEA makes money putting people in jail for a plant, and that's an outdated mindset. And hopefully, they have an election less than a week away, and one candidate isn't going to legalize it through and through, partly because of his own, own history in regards to his own son. I think he kind of looks at cannabis still as a gateway drug. Ironically, when his son may or may not have had a serious drug incident, and
Mm.
he was able to not go to jail for that, and he was able to get rehab, et cetera, et cetera. When unfortunately there are a lot of people that have had ruined lives because of a plant, and haven't had that same empathy that he's had with his own family. But he is planning to decriminalize it, which will then shift it to the states and allow them to kind of classify it any way they want. So it's progress, and hopefully just less people go to jail for a plant.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And we've written about the kind of racist origins of the war on drugs before. And what I find so funny about it is if you look at the advertisements or the propaganda against cannabis, initially it starts out as if you smoke, you'll become a murderer and you will kill the people closest to you. And then it eventually progresses to if you smoke, you're going to be lazy, which I feel like is the complete opposite message. And
Yeah,
now we're
exactly.
seeing, because of the groundswell of people like yourself and other advocates, cannabis is medicinally legal. And people are using it to treat things like epilepsy, like Parkinson's. And there's this huge contradiction, this like huge history of contradictions where they've just changed the messaging every few years to try and keep it illegal. And I think finally, even though it's very slow, we are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. I think we are seeing a bit of
Hmm.
change, which is really positive. And again, it's due to people like yourself really pushing that, and probably in a lot of ways to your own detriment. I think putting yourself out there and really saying, hey, this is what I believe in. Did you find any resistance against that? Were any people like, you're the fighting guy, stick to your box, don't talk about weed?
Oh, definitely. But again, that's why eh, I don't know. Anyone that kind of goes against the grain usually gets something to that effect. My idol for a long time has always been Muhammad Ali, and he was able to risk it all to be on the right side of history. And I plan to do that, being on the cannabis side of history.
I love that. And you've just touched upon previously the USADA, the anti-doping agency. I think you mentioned
Hmm.
previously the WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency.
Anti-doping agency.
And then Canada has the CCES, the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport.
Hmm.
Having been through all that you've been through to get your therapeutic use exemption, how do you see these governing bodies? Do you still see it as, well, cannabis is, the views on cannabis have been outdated. It's not really anyone's fault anymore. It's just kind of this like residual stigma that surrounds it. Or do you view them as playing a significant role in preventing people from using the medicines they need?
In the U.S. specifically, yes, and then the United States Anti-Doping Agency, again, because they get funding from the U.S. and their classification of cannabis as a Schedule One drug. Canada, unfortunately, in regards to the CCES, they're very much lockstep in regards to the World Anti-Doping Agency. They've actually suggested every 3 years they have every 2 to 3 years they have uh, basically a committee to kind of have suggestions in regards to what to do. And I think for the last two cycles of that, Canada and the CCS has suggested removing cannabis from the prohibited list. But the US and Japan have the stringent, what's it called, VU on cannabis, and they won't ratify it.
Mm. Well, last question, Elias. What does the future hold for you? What do you've picked the torch up for cannabis? I think we were speaking previously, right before the call, about your potential acting career as well. What is on the horizon for you, Elias?
Well, I'm going to keep fighting inside the cage and out. Obviously, my next opponent, which will be announced soon, when I plan to knock cannabis out of the prohibited list and validate my therapeutic use exemption. And again, it'll be on a revolutionary platform called Imagine BC, which is very much a equitable platform that actually allows content creators like myself and viewers to actually have a stake in regards to their data. So I'm very excited in that capacity and kind of being on that revolutionary front in its own right. It'll be a 19 plus event, which will be age gated and allow me to actually advertise cannabis on the event. And
Mm.
again, another first of its kind. So I'm really excited about that and make history in that regard. And then again, open the door for other athletes so they don't have to have that same, trials and tribulations and hurdles that I had to go through. And I'm going to keep on fighting because I love winning, and I'm going to win inside the cage and out. And then, as you mentioned, obviously, I have acting. I have some acting gigs working up. Obviously, COVID kind of slowed everything down for everyone, but in the new year, I'm really excited to start those opening when I kind of do some pretty original projects. One of them we were talking about called Last Hit, where I play an MMA fighter, huge stretch, and I get injured and I reinvent myself with competitive video gaming. esports. And it's really going to be cool. The best way I kind of explained it, it's like Southpaw meets Wizard with a little dash of dodgeball. It's a comedy.
Oh
So
wow,
I'll
amazing.
be in a wheelchair for majority of the film, but it's still a comedy, and it really kind of shines a light on regards to how athletes and more people in general, when faced with a life changing situation, injury, whatever it ends up being, and being forced to change who you are. How do you rise to the occasion? And that's what I plan to do. Again, both in this film and the TV shows and other film that I'm working on. And again, more importantly, inside the cage.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Elias. I'm looking forward to seeing all the films. Looking forward to seeing your next fight. Again, thank you for doing this with me. I really appreciate it. Did you have any final comments you wanted to add for our viewers?
Thank you so much for your time. And if you want to follow my journey, you can follow me at Elias Theodorou. And I'll have updates on my next fight, which will be taking place before the end of the year. And I'm really excited to make history, not only for myself, but all other athletes.